Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading stories about the paranormal. I hope you enjoy them. So for now, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. This story happened around 2014 in my grandparents' house. In January of 2013, my uncle sadly passed away from cancer in one of the bedrooms of my grandparents' home. Up until around 2012, when my uncle got sick and started living with my grandparents, I stayed at their house almost every weekend to just hang out with them. When my uncle got sick, him and his two daughters moved in with my grandparents, so my cousins shared one room and my uncle slept in the other. He was terribly sick, and unfortunately passed away in January 2013 in that bedroom. After he passed, my cousins still lived with my grandparents, so one of them took his old room. This story takes place around February of 2013. The cousin that took my uncle's old room was going out for the night on a Saturday, so I decided to go to my grandparents' house and stay over. Normally I would sleep on the couch, but since she was gone, I decided to take her bed. I definitely did feel a little uneasy sleeping in his old room, but I eventually fell asleep. I don't know what time it was when this happened, but likely around 2 a.m. since nobody else was awake and my grandparents did tend to stay up past midnight to 1 a.m. most of the time. I had a feeling someone was in my room, but it didn't wake me enough for me to fully be aware of what was happening. I felt someone sit on the edge of the bed and kiss me on my cheek. It was so clear as day. I swore it was one of my grandparents. So when I woke up, I asked if anyone had came in my room last night. They both said no. My uncle and I were super close, so I like to think it was him visiting me. Still to this day, my grandma says she will see my uncle in their house from time to time, coming and going from the back door to their bedroom, where his ashes are kept. There's a house in downtown Ventura that is reportedly very haunted. It's a huge old house. My sister met a woman who used to live there. It has 7 bedrooms spread over 4 levels. I'm not sure what the architect type is called, so I'll just describe it as an old wood frame house with an antique ornate style, picturesque, set on the foothill overlooking downtown and the ocean and the Channel Islands. When I lived in the area, the house was vacant. During my frequent late-night walks, I'd sometimes sneak up to the 24 front stairs and peer in the windows or walk around back. Occasionally, I'd bring a date up there to fool around on the porch swing. It was vacant for a long time. My sister told me the house was haunted, and once, when she was visiting the house, a floor lamp suddenly slid across the living room, apparently of its own volition. Startled, she looked at her friend, the woman who lived there, and she kind of shrugged and said that things like that occurred frequently. They would often hear noises from the upper floor. There was another tenant who resided up there, and sometimes they would hear noises, like someone talking or walking around, only to find out later that the tenant was not at home. She eventually moved out, and sometime later I met her and I asked her about the house. She confirmed the lamp story and said that many things happened there and that she moved out because of them. She had hated living there. She said, "Let me show you something." She pulled out her phone and flipped to a photograph of a young man sitting on a sofa in front of a dark picture window, or maybe glass sliding doors. She said that it was her son on the couch. The photo was just kind of a typical random snapshot of a kid sitting on a couch. Also in the photo was a large swirl of white smoke to the right of the kid. It looked like cigarette smoke that had drifted in front of the lens, except when I looked closer, I was startled and frightened by what I had noticed about it. There was a very clearly defined face in the smoke. Not a human face, but one of a creature with an elongated muzzle and head shaped like a canine. The mouth was open, showing large, sharp, pointy teeth. The eyes were fierce and appeared to be looking into the camera. I truly hate to say this because I tend to roll my eyes at stories like this, but it is best described as a dragon or demon face. I don't believe in demons. The image was unmistakable and gave me chills and goosebumps. The woman said that she hadn't seen anything when she took the photo, that it was just a casual snapshot of her son while they were sitting and watching television. She managed to get the landlord to reluctantly let her out of the lease after she told him everything that happened there. Eventually, they found tenants. There were old cars and beat-up motorcycles out front, and junk stored on the porches and balconies, so they didn't appear to be neat, clean, orderly tenants, and the house looked in need of repairs and maintenance. I never met the new residents, but I wonder if they had any experiences in that creepy old house. Nine years ago, during the summer of 2013, my uncle called me one day asking if I wanted to take a road trip to Alaska. We live on the southern tip of Texas, across the Rio Grande from Progreso, Mexico, so I thought he was joking. It takes us 12 hours to get out of Texas from where we're from, so driving to Alaska sounded insane. However, he was not joking, and about a week later I climbed into his dingy 1990 Chevrolet camper van with my two younger cousins, a 13-year-old female and a 10-year-old male. And we headed out on our 3-week excursion. I was a 15-year-old male at the time, a freshman in high school, and excited to see some new parts of the country. It took us about a week and a half to leave the United States, going through northern Washington. Still, by that time, we had been on the road for a while. We were getting a little annoyed being around each other 24/7, and we were generally trying to hightail it through Canada and get back home in a shorter amount of time. After arguing with my younger cousins for a while, I finally managed to fight my way into the front seat because that's where all of us kids wanted to sit. So I officially became the co-pilot. Even though I had an iPhone with GPS, my uncle was an old-school road trip fanatic, so he made whoever was in the front seat use this gigantic atlas book to give him directions as we drove. This night, we had just turned on a Highway 16 in Prince George, Canada, and we were going to be on that road for hours, so I had the atlas open on my lap, but I wasn't looking at it much. It was about 2 a.m., and my uncle decided we would drive through the night to make up some time, so naturally, I stayed in the front seat to keep him company while he went. We were swapping stories and making small talk, and my two cousins passed out in the back seats while driving down this somewhat desolate highway. At one point, while my uncle was telling me a story and I was looking out the window, I became mesmerized by the streetlights as they flew by my passenger side window. It was like I fell into this mindless trance of watching a streetlight go by and mentally counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then another would go by and I'd restart my counting. I did this for several minutes for no reason. Still, something about the perfect yellow illuminated circles the lights would cast against the pitch black asphalt appealed to me, followed by 5 seconds of unrelenting darkness before the next morning would pass. It was soothing. That all changed when I saw the next streetlight coming up from my peripheral vision, but something was standing underneath it. I only had about a second to assess what it was. Still, I saw a petite older woman, maybe 5 feet tall at most, hunched over with a red shawl covering her hair, casting a shadow on her face, and holding a canvas tote bag that looked like it had something heavy inside. I specifically remember that she was wearing an off-white summer dress that went down to about her knees because it was cold outside, maybe about 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and I couldn't believe she didn't have pants on. Now, seeing this woman didn't necessarily alarm me in any way. It was more like I took notice of her and let my imagination take over with, oh man, that's creepy to see a random old lady standing under a streetlight in the middle of the night next to a pitch black forest. About this time, there was a lull in the conversation with my uncle. He had the radio on very low, and I was still staring out of my window, enjoying the hum of the roads as we kept driving. About 20 seconds after we passed that lady, the radio station we were listening to started emitting static and increased in volume. at least enough for my uncle to take notice and turn it down. It was a weird coincidence, but we were driving in a forest, so it didn't surprise me that radio signals could get lost out here. However, what was less explainable was that seconds after the radio went to static, the dashboard lighting that illuminates all the gauges for the driver started flickering on and off for over a minute. This got my uncle's attention, because running into an electrical issue at night would be a nightmare. As the lights are flickering, we see a sign that says fuel 1 mile ahead, or something to that effect. So he says, "Hey, I'm going to pull in and grab a cup of coffee and fill up." He pulls into this well-lit gas station, and we are the only ones there. He starts fueling up and tells me to stay outside with the kids while he goes inside for coffee. So I stand outside the van to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. As I'm standing there, I'm mindlessly looking around, and at some point I start to notice how eerily quiet it is. I hear the faint gurgle of gas pouring into the car from the nozzle. I hear the low hum of the incandescent bulbs that illuminate the pumps. I hear the light tapping of some of the more giant moths smacking into the glass pane covering those bulbs. There is no other noise, however. There are no cicadas in the trees, cars on the road, bats flapping their wings, air blowing. Nothing. It was unsettling enough to understand how entirely alone it was out here. My uncle walks back out, puts the fuel nozzle away, climbs back into the car, uncaps his coffee, and just quietly watches the steam cascade off the top of the liquid. I watched him this whole time because I thought it was a little unusual that he didn't start the car immediately. But then he turned to me with a slightly concerned look and quietly said, "Did you see that woman under the street lamp a few miles back?" I sighed with relief and chuckled softly because his bringing it up verified what I had seen was real. And I said, "Yeah, I did. She was kind of creepy." And he gave me a strange, expressionless smile, like he was trying to portray calm agreement. But it just seemed off. It seemed like something was bothering him that he wasn't telling me. Before I could say anything else, we pulled out of the gas station and headed north on Highway 16 as we were before, but slower now, because he had a massive cup of scalding hot coffee in his hand. And why he insisted on driving without a lid on is baffling to me. I noticed that the radio had returned to broadcasting soft music instead of static, and there wasn't anything wrong with the interior lighting. I told my uncle, "Do you think it was a coincidence that the radio and lights started malfunctioning right after we passed that lady?" He kept his eyes trained on the road ahead, as he grimly said, "Maybe." So, at this point, I figured he was trying to mess with me by making this seem more unnatural or paranormal than it was by taking on this serious tone. I tried to lighten the mood by saying, "Wouldn't it be crazy if we saw her again up the road?" And I got no response. Fine. At this point, I was slightly paranoid, but mostly just confused by my uncle's demeanor. So I opened the atlas and started flipping through the pages to kill time, and maybe find a route for us to take the next day. A few minutes go by. My eyes are focused on the map trying to make out highway numbers in the dim lighting of my cell phone screen. And suddenly, my uncle says, "No effing way." The intensity in his voice made my head snap up to look at him, and I saw pure, unadulterated fear on his face as he looked out towards my side of the windshield and said, "The lady." I whipped my head around to see if he was messing with me again, and I didn't see anything as I looked at the following street lamp in the distance. I looked back and said, "Ha ha, very funny." But he cut me off and frantically said, "I swear to God she was under that street lamp we just passed." Now I was annoyed and concerned because I was terrified of the paranormal at that time. And my uncle was driving, so if he was starting to hallucinate from exhaustion, that was dangerous. Before I could say anything else, he started slowing down and whipping the van around to start heading back down the road from where we just came. And I said, "What the hell are you doing?" And he didn't say a word. His eyes were locked on the side of the road where he had seen this lady. Right then, like clockwork, the radio goes to static again. This sent violent shivers down my spine. I was uncomfortable with what was happening, and it was physically impossible for this lady to have moved ahead of us down the road then. It was at least 5 miles back from where we saw her the first time, and it had not even been 20 minutes. Not to mention that not a single vehicle passed the gas station in either direction the entire time I was there. So she would have had to have sprinted 5 miles in 20 minutes without me noticing her pass the gas station. Impossible. As my uncle slowed down in front of the street lamp where he had seen her, the lights on the dashboard started flickering again, and I felt an overwhelming wave of nausea. I just had a visceral fear of the situation and didn't hide it. I pleaded with my uncle to please turn the van around without stopping, so we could get as far away from here as possible, but he was unrelenting. He scoured the wood line with the headlights trying to find this woman again, but there was no sign of anything. I put my face in my hands and leaned forward to escape for a couple of seconds, because I honestly didn't want to find out if she was there. Right then, through the radio static, we all froze for a few seconds as we heard a crackly, disembodied voice say, "Patricia, help." At that point, I started crying. It was too much. There were no more coincidences or explanations for what was happening. I wish I could have passed out from fear to avoid what I saw next. After what felt like an eternity, but was about 2 minutes, he could not find her, so he started to turn the van around, but this time he did a slower 3-point turn like he was defeated and almost disappointed. I looked back up from my hands, happy to know that we would move past this, until he made the final slight turn to start heading back north again, and I almost threw up. She was standing on the side of the road, right effing there, no more than 20 feet in front of the van. My uncle let out an F-bomb loud enough to wake up the kids, whom I had forgotten were in the back by this point. So when I heard a faint female's voice say, "What's wrong?" from right behind me, I had to summon all my willpower to keep myself from pissing myself. I screamed like a child and jumped high enough to hit my head on the van's roof, closely followed by my cousin's blood-curdling scream once she noticed the lady on the road. The inside of that car was pure chaos for about 10 seconds. It wasn't until we both noticed that my uncle had not floored it yet that she said, "Papa, drive." I could not have agreed more with that statement. He had just started pressing down on the pedal when this woman, in the most inhuman and contorted movements, lifted her head just high enough for the streetlight to illuminate her completely blank, stark white face. There was nothing on it. No mouth, no eyes, no nose. It had deep, shadowy wrinkles and 2 shallow recesses where the eyes should be. I started gagging. My cousin started bawling uncontrollably. The younger male cousin let out the most pitiful and fearful moan I've ever heard. And finally, my uncle floored it. I had this deep sense of dread that, at that moment, the van would eventually shut down. And at that point, I would probably die from fear. It didn't, however. We peeled out of there as fast as the old van let us, and we just drove. We drove in stone-cold silence, not saying a word to each other, not looking at each other, and just praying for morning to come so we could try to forget what we had just witnessed. None of us ever talked about that night after that. The rest of the trip seemed to go by quickly, but it was different. There was a palpable tension between us, just wanting to return home and forget everything. On our way back, we made it a point to drive down Highway 16 in the middle of the day, speeding the entire time. I had kept a daily journal of our trip, so I could go back and reminisce years later, but I didn't write anything about that night because I knew I would never forget it. I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't until years later when I became interested in true crime podcasts and narrators on YouTube telling scary stories that everything changed. I was driving home from Austin alone one day, nothing unusual for me, and I was listening to some serial killer podcast. I had no idea which killer they were talking about at the time. Still, during the 2 hosts' banter about how this killer would target women and then dump their bodies along the highway, the other host said, "That kind of reminds me of that one highway in Canada where the same thing happened. You know, they call it the Highway of Tears or something. I think it was Highway 16 or 17 or something." When I heard him say Highway 16, I nearly crashed my truck because my arm holding the wheel jolted as I got a rush of fear through my entire body. I immediately pulled over on the side of the road and Googled Ghosts of Highway 16, only to stumble on this article. I have honestly never felt that sick in my entire life. I had long since pushed that memory out of my mind, so it never even occurred to me to research if other people had similar experiences on that stretch of road. Even if it had happened to me, I don't think I would have wanted to search for it, because it would have made the experience more authentic. It took me 5 separate attempts to get through that article, because the first time, I felt tears welling up in my eyes as soon as I saw the highway photo. That was my last road trip with my uncle and cousins. When I'm in my hometown driving around at night, I have perpetual anxiety that on some lonely street she might reappear. And this time, I won't have anyone there with me. Now, I don't know if Patricia is one of the victims of that highway, or someone to whom a victim was calling out for help, but I don't intend to research any further. May she and anyone else who met that fate rest in peace. But if not, who knows? My husband works at the Oregon State Hospital, a facility infamous for its past treatment of mental illness and where the classic film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was shot. Despite its dark past, the facility had become a place of healing for many individuals suffering from mental illnesses. However, as with many older buildings, a portion of the asylum was scheduled to be demolished. As part of his cleaning duties, my husband ventured into the abandoned portion of the building, which had been devoid of any human activity for a considerable length of time. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. During his lunch break, he decided to call me to check in. When I answered the phone, I could hear what sounded like people talking in the distance. However, the voices were muffled and indistinct. He sounded distracted and didn't seem to be listening to anything I was saying. Irritated, I snapped at him and asked if he was calling to talk to me or them. My husband was confused and quickly replied that he was alone in the building. My heart sank as I realized that something wasn't right. There was a panic in his voice that I had never heard before in our 19 years of marriage. After that experience, my husband was understandably shaken, but he continued to work at the asylum. He never had another experience like that again, but the memory of that day still creeps us out. When my cousin's son was little, he was super attached to his imaginary friend named Joseph. He would take Joseph everywhere and do things like demand that his parents buckle him into the car, so he was definitely more attached than most kids. But some kids just have really realistic imaginary friends, so they didn't think it was anything weird. Fast forward several years. My cousins have moved out of that house and their son is a lot older. One day, my dad runs into the family, who had bought the house from them, who has a little boy of their own. As the conversation goes on, it gets brought up that the little boy who lives in the house now has an imaginary friend he is super attached to named Joe. Obviously, my cousin tells the family about his son who had his imaginary friend named Joseph while living in that same house. It's interesting, but ultimately assume it's just a funny coincidence. Fast forward again to the present day. The last family moved out of the house, and for several years it sat vacant. Recently, someone bought the house and renovated it. One day, my cousin ran into the guy who was renovating it. They live in a small town. It's not weird that he keeps seeing the people who bought this old house. They were talking about the noise, and my cousin mentioned the funny coincidence about the two boys having an imaginary friend with a similar name. At that point, the guy doing the renovations tells my cousin that while they were taking out a wall in the house, they found an old journal that had the name Joseph written on either the cover or first page. Unfortunately, I don't think they kept the journal, but at the very least, it's a very spooky coincidence. So, I'm a pretty skeptical person when it comes to the paranormal, albeit having a vested interest in tales and evidence. I'm the kind of person who browses ghost hunter videos on YouTube and these kinds of subreddits. I've also visited plenty of purportedly haunted locations in the US, including, but not limited to, places like the Omni Parker House in Boston, Molly Brown House in Denver, the Whaley House in San Diego, Alcatraz at night, and the Winchester house more than once, none of which have yielded any sort of evidence. A part of me wants to believe, but I'm also terrified at the prospect of witnessing something. I was mostly a non-believer up until a couple of months ago. In short, I had wanted to plan a surprise party and getaway for my girlfriend's 30th birthday. She had mentioned wanting to go hit the slopes. It was January, so it's still winter at this point. I organized this months ahead and had invited some of her closest friends to join. I ended up renting an Airbnb cabin that had enough rooms to house 10 people, or 5 couples. One entire lower floor basement level with 2 beds, a room on the first floor, and 3 rooms upstairs. Also adding that this cabin was in a beautiful rural neighborhood in Tahoe, California, with tons of cabins next door, down the street, adjacent, etc. So there's plenty of housing around us. Nothing peculiar about it, and there are other people staying around. Of course, my girlfriend and I take the master bedroom upstairs, and right across the hall is another couple in one room, and my girlfriend's cousin by herself in the 3rd room next door. All rooms are taken, and the middle floor is a lively area with games, a fireplace, and a foosball table. These details are somewhat relevant and important later in my story. The first night was a night of merry drinking and games. To celebrate the occasion, we had decorated the living room and blown up balloons to be loosely strewn around the large and cozy living room and family room where we imbibed. Almost uneventful with respect to weird happenings. Except towards the end of the night, balloons would randomly pop at odd intervals. Someone in our group suggested it was the balloons getting attracted towards the heater vents and popping. I was dismissive of this because not all of them that popped were congregated near vents. Cool, I just took note. Didn't want to argue or suggest anything weird at this point. After we all retired for the night and the lights were off, we could hear balloons pop downstairs at random intervals that reverberated through the silent house. This happened between 2 to 3:30 a.m. The next morning, still plenty of healthy balloons strewn about. Fast forward to night 2. After we returned from snow activities, we prepped for drinking and the usual. After a full day's worth of shredding the snow, we are all collectively tired a bit earlier than the previous night and decide to retire at around 11:30 to midnight. Here's where I personally experienced things that got me feeling irked. Since it was cold, I decided to go downstairs to turn on the thermostat and heater. Our couple friends across the hall had their door slightly open. Lights were on, and bathroom was in use. As I'm going downstairs in the dark stairwell, I hear the floorboards behind me creak and figured it was my friend coming out to follow me for a cup of water or go to the kitchen. As I walk across the living room and stop at the thermostat, the lights are still off at this point and the creaks continue. And then I hear it stop a few feet behind me near the kitchen. The kitchen lights don't turn on, and I hear nothing else. Feeling like he was waiting behind me, and I was being watched, I said, "What's up, dude? Need something?" I turn around and nobody was there. I've only ever read about this dreadful feeling of being watched, and it is indeed every bit dreadful upon realization in person. A minute ago, I swore someone followed me down. I was taken aback, and my skeptical self once again took note and spoke nothing of it. I go back upstairs. About 30 minutes pass and it's still cold. At this point, everyone is asleep, and I decide to turn up the thermostat a couple notches. Nothing crazy. I turn on the upstairs hallway light bright enough to light the steps to see from downstairs. I proceeded to head downstairs and stop once again at the thermostat. No floorboard creaks except for my own steps this time. As I'm turning up the thermostat and thinking to myself how odd the creaking was the first time, a noise broke my train of thought. I hear the ball from the foosball table several feet away near the fireplace audibly roll across its surface and hit one of the side walls. Nobody is around, and I certainly am too far to touch it. I froze in fear and hastily go back upstairs to sleep, not knowing how to mentally process the increasingly evident occurrences. I eventually sleep under the pretense that nothing is definitive enough for me to be conclusively sure that this cabin is haunted. I don't mention or wake anyone up about my experiences. The next morning, as we leave and drive back home, the balloons were brought up by my girlfriend's friend/couple who stayed across the hall. I took this as an opening to talk about my experiences and disclosed them. At this point, my girlfriend's friend goes pale, gets serious, and tells us that the previous night She was wide awake when she noticed a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. She states that she went into panic mode after blinking and realizing it wasn't a dream or hallucination, and shook her boyfriend awake, who I thought followed me down the stairs earlier that night, only to have it disappear. This by far, coupled with my experiences, is undeniable evidence. I myself was wide-eyed upon hearing this solid piece of information. My girlfriend's cousin, who stayed in the room next to us, then mentions she heard what sounded like breathing in her room, but dismissed it as naturally occurring sounds of the walls in the cabin. These events stand alone could be nominal and may be explained, but collectively, it's hard to deny that something was present and amiss. I'm hoping that this is the extent of my run-ins with the paranormal, because I don't want to experience anything like this again. The universe has made me more of a believer. I love walking in the woods, but some strange things have happened in the woods. Have you had anything weird happen to you? This was one of the strangest things that happened to me. It was a beautiful day for a hike in the woods, so I grabbed my backpack and set out on the trail. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the leaves rustled gently in the breeze. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed that the sounds of nature had grown quieter. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I saw her. A woman dressed in white, standing at the edge of a clearing. She looked like she was from another time, with a long flowing dress and a ribbon tied around her waist. At first, I thought she might be lost or in trouble, so I approached her cautiously. But as I got closer, she vanished into thin air, leaving only the sound of rustling leaves behind. I was shaken, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to follow her. So I continued on the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the clearing where I had seen the woman, I heard the faint sound of music. It was a haunting melody, played on a violin. I stepped into the clearing and saw her again, the woman in white, dancing to the music of an unseen player. She twirled and spun, her dress billowing in the breeze. But then, as suddenly as before, she vanished again, leaving me alone in the clearing. I left the woods that day feeling haunted by the memory of the ghostly woman in white. I never saw her again, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by something not quite of this world. I genuinely believe that I myself, not the areas I've lived in or have been to, am haunted. I wish this could be shorter, but there's a whole lot to say, and I'd appreciate some feedback. I also know that this community doesn't like sleep paralysis stories, but I know that mine weren't just sleep paralysis, but were paranormal encounters. As a kid, I went through a lot. It really messed me up when my dad left my mom, and it made me feel really unsafe. I don't know why, but I've felt like something has been after me my whole life. No BS. I was strangely aware of death from a very young age, and it terrified me to even think of my family members dying. And I'd have terrible nightmares about awful things happening to my brother, dad, or mom starting at age 6 that I can remember. I've also had sleep paralysis my entire life, but didn't know what it was until a few years ago. I also realized that the stories I mention here weren't really sleep paralysis, but real encounters. I do have sleep paralysis on occasion, but it's nothing like what I describe here. So on one hand, I was scared to fall asleep because of my awful nightmares, and on the other, I was terrified of seeing the things I saw then and still see today. I had 2 windows in my room, one behind my bed and the other next to my bed. I kept my curtains open because the streetlight made me more comfortable falling asleep than my nightlight, as all of my nightlights I had would mysteriously lose battery life after a few days, and would flash randomly on and off throughout the night and day or make random clicking noises. I remember so clearly as it happened frequently from when I was maybe 7 to age 12 when we moved out of that house, seeing a figure outside of my window, a moving figure, usually as dark as the night and in some sort of robe, looked a lot like the ghost of Christmas Future. And this same figure occurred in many of my nightmares as well. It usually just planted a hand on my window or started banging on it and continued to do so until I fell asleep. Other times I'd wake up to my sleep paralysis. I genuinely saw the figure in the window because it always was before I fell asleep and never woke me up in the middle of the night. So I know that it wasn't just sleep paralysis and I could move just fine. And a similar figure, dark but not robed and usually donned a wide-brimmed hat, stood in the center of my room. He usually reached out to me, but other times he just stood there watching, even though I couldn't see if he had eyes. That was when I was a child and I lived in that house. That was pretty much all the creepy stuff that happened there. And yet, I didn't really believe in ghosts until I was 13. The problem is, I'm pretty sure that I'm the one that's haunted. My mom's apartment, after we moved from our previous house, which was new and no one had died in it, so it was very mysterious that I had these experiences, is old as hell. This apartment was originally built in 1920 and was only recently barely restored. It has its problems, like leaky ceilings and bugs, but that's about it. But maybe the first time I experienced anything there was when I was 13. My room was really messy in the farther half of my room, where my TV was set up. Very strangely, the two cats we had would not go past the front half of my room, towards my closet and TV. I was really curious about it one time and set my cat carefully in front of my TV, where she screeched. That's not something she ever did, and sprinted out of my room. She was obsessed with me and mostly spent her time in my room, but only in the front half where my bed was. My mom even peeked in at her meowing at the TV one time when I was at my dad's. Then one night, I had gotten ready for bed and was about to lie down when I noticed the light coming from the other half of my room. My DVD player was on, and I hadn't used my TV or the DVD player in months, and it hadn't been on just 30 minutes prior. So what the hell happened? I knew very well that the cats wouldn't go near it, so I went to turn it off, and the DVD player has this little screen on it that says what it's doing. Things like searching, ejecting, turning off. But this time it said something that I've never even seen it say before. Controls. It turns out that you can click on the settings button of the DVD player and click a few more options to get to the screen where it would say that. But I didn't press those buttons and neither did the cats. So I turned it off and strangely fell asleep just fine. Little things have happened in my mom's apartment since, but nothing that could be clearly described as a paranormal occurrence. Until the last few years. I changed my room around in my mom's apartment when I was 16. I got a bigger bed and put it on the wall in that far half of my room where the TV used to be, and I put the TV in the front half of my room. The first thing I noticed was in my old Connect, which sat on top of the TV. It was a big box TV. I never used the Connect, but it was connected to the Xbox and would turn on when I turned on the Xbox. I could see the little Connect icon on my home screen and began noticing figures behind me, where my TV had been and now my bed was, but they didn't move. They were very humanoid, and nothing in my room would make those shapes, let alone show up so prominently on the Connect. Then came the touching. I began to feel someone touching me all the time. I would lie in bed and feel someone slowly press up against me. I would be in my kitchen and suddenly feel someone touch my back or shoulder when no one else was home. I could even be in school, standing behind my friends with no one else behind me, and feel someone touch my shoulder. That's when I also realized that it wasn't just happening at home. Not to mention my sleep paralysis began to get worse when I slept in my bed after it moved to the paranormal side of the room. But it changed from that figure to other things, like spiders crawling all over me, or a human intruder breaking into my room through my window and reaching in their hand. I could see it, hear it all happening, but no one was there. I can tell now that was real sleep paralysis instead of my paranormal kinds, as they were brief and didn't feel as threatening. My paranormal kind lasted hours and is more ominous than threatening, even as a child. Then came the name calling. You know the feeling you get when someone says your name but they didn't? Now imagine that happening when no one's there. Everywhere I went, school, Dad's house, Mom's house, someone calling my name, usually in my own voice or some man's, but the voice was never creepy. If it was my voice, it sounded like I was screaming my own name, but if it was that man's, it sounded almost loving and caring. But no one was there. But the footsteps creeped me out the most. The footsteps started when my brother left for college, and my mom and I were left in her apartment alone. The footsteps also still happen today. My mom works a crappy schedule at a nearby hospital and goes to bed at around 7 p.m. to wake up at 3:30 a.m. I used to go to bed at around 10. My mom sleeps like crap. She always has and probably always will. So she wakes up in the middle of the night, almost every night. One night when I was 16, I was lying in bed about to fall asleep when I heard pots and pans banging in the kitchen. I was tired and I just assumed my mom couldn't sleep and got up and did the dishes or something. Then I heard footsteps outside of my door and saw a shadow underneath. Kinda weird. My mom had zero reason to come near my door. The next day after she got home from work, I asked her what she was doing the night before. She said she slept great and she didn't get up once. My mom didn't believe in ghosts, at least not spirits that would be around our small town or anything. If it was something bigger and a lot happened there or many people died, that was one thing. But when my mom started hearing the footsteps at night, she started to realize that the stuff I've been saying might not be so crazy after all. She even started asking me if I had gotten up at the night, when I usually slept great and didn't get up at all. Occasionally, we've heard the footsteps and have seen the shadow from underneath our doors together. Occasionally, we walk out just to see if we straight up have an intruder, just to see nothing there, but continue hearing the footsteps go around the house where we're looking. I've heard my mom's voice as if she was talking to someone, when in reality, she was fast asleep. I've seen things out of the corner of my eye, pale creatures on all fours with dark eyes. I've seen that thing out of the corner of my eyes all the time, regardless of where I am. Right before I left for college, I had sleep paralysis again, after not having it for a year. I was laying in my bed and there was a strange bright light pointing towards the dark figure at the end of my bed, with glowing red eyes and a wide-brimmed hat. But for some reason, this time I wasn't scared or even nervous. I had an overwhelming sensation of relief, and the only thought in my normally loud and buzzing head was literally, "Thank God you're here, I've missed you." I then fell asleep right after. I have no idea why I thought that. I hadn't seen this figure so clearly since the night I got my second COVID shot, which was about a year prior, and I was terrified of it then. But this was the only time it had red eyes. I never saw its eyes before. Part of me thinks that this was a new ghost or something, and I have to admit I've been longing for that sense of relief I had when I saw them there at the end of the bed. But part of me is just so damn curious and wonders if this is the same ghost, but has had good intentions all along. Then I went to college. Nothing happened for months until I came back after Thanksgiving break, deciding to drop out at the end of the semester. All of a sudden, I'd be in my dorm room and see that pale creature out of the corner of my eye again. All of a sudden, I'd feel the touches when I was lying in my bunk. All of a sudden, I'd hear that man's sweet voice call out my name out of nowhere, and nowhere to be found. Now I'm back home, and my nightmares lately have been particularly bad. My nightmares since I was a kid have always had 3 themes. I'm being chased, I'm being watched, or something is hurting my family. But my nightmares over the past few months have changed into I'm alone, my family hates me, or someone is after me. Not to mention a single nightmare where my family was possessed, and the only safe place to hide from them was my room. This could have nothing to do with my ghosts or anything, but I also think it's strange that the paranormal occurrences have been happening more often than not now that I'm back home. The footsteps are back, and I hear them almost every night. Last night even, my door cracked open the slightest bit when I was playing a game on my computer. I see the pale creature all the time, peeking around the doorways or scampering at the end of my bed. Frequently, I've felt someone laying beside me, but now instead of being worried, I feel comforted. While the pale figures still terrify me, I genuinely miss that dark figure that I saw at the end of my bed. I wonder if the feeling that someone's laying next to me in my bed is the same spirit. I've tried talking to him. I say him because it's a rather overwhelming masculine presence that I feel. But without, actual ghost equipment, which may or may not even work, I can't get an actual answer. All I can say is that it doesn't seem that he can move things, but he can hear me. Maybe a week ago, I was laying on my stomach when I felt someone slowly lay across my legs, kind of like a big dog, but my back stiffened. So right when I was about to roll over, I said, "I'm gonna roll over now, but if you want to lay with me, you can after I move." And I rolled over and felt a whole body lay on top of me, to the point that I thought that if I opened my eyes, I would see his face. I opened my eyes, but obviously no one was there. I even looked down at my legs, still feeling numb and feeling the weight of someone on me when no one was there. But it was comforting. I've started calling them my ghostie, since he seems to care about me. I've considered that this could be like a ploy of like a demon or something, but I don't feel drained. Now that I'm back home, I actually feel happier than I've been in my entire life, ghosts and all. I think I could have created an egregore, a spirit that manifests out of mass feelings of sadness or depression, or something from the trauma I had when I was a kid. I was a very depressed little girl, and I remember contemplating offing myself when I was in first grade. But that wouldn't explain why I still have these experiences when I'm happy, and they're even stronger. And what are the pale creatures I see lurking around? I actually see those at my dad's house more often than here at my mom's. But I'll discuss what happened at my dad's place in another post. And why would I start being comforted by the spirit that caused me so much fear and depression in the first place? I'd love to hear what everyone thinks of this. Am I haunted? Or am I just going to coincidentally haunted places? Why would I, specifically, be targeted? This is the part 2 to the previous post. If you've read my previous post, you know that I've had countless paranormal experiences regardless of where I am or who's around me. In part 1, I really only mentioned some things that occurred away from home and at my mom's houses, but I experienced similar and also incredibly different experiences at my dad's, and would love your opinions on this. So my grandfather on my dad's side built a house for his mother when he was in his 20s. She grew old and even died in the living room of that house. When she died, and after my dad left my mom, my dad bought it. He restored it, put in a pool, this and that. My room there was actually her old room before she died. I was 8 when my dad bought that house, so I had plenty of paranormal occurrences prior from living with my mom in her old house. My brother believes in ghosts, but he swears up and down that the only reason he believes, and the only time he's experienced anything paranormal, was in my dad's old house. He refuses, however, to tell us what happened to him while we lived there. Now, I mentioned my great-grandmother's passing, but I know she's not a ghost haunting me or that house. I didn't even know her. That and my spirits all feel very masculine in presence. If one of my ghosts, however, is a poltergeist, I probably acquired it from there. Not much happened at my dad's old house in the grand scheme of things. I lived there, part-time obviously because my parents divorced when I was 5. For the longest time out of any place I've lived, from age 8 to 16. But the few stories I have to tell about this place are significantly scarier to me than my ghostie that I have at my mom's. Not to mention the stuff I've seen at my dad's new place. Stuff moved around, constantly. I'd set my toothbrush on the vanity counter, just for it suddenly to be thrown off. Thrown. I'd see shadows stand in my doorway so often. The same one I usually saw in my paranormal kind of sleep paralysis at my mom's old house, and recently in her apartment. But this time I was wide awake at my dad's. That I had to start shutting my door before I went to bed. I'd hear shuffling from right outside my window, and even though I could see the moonlight coming through my closed curtains, I couldn't see a shadow where a person making those shuffling footsteps would be. I never had sleep paralysis there. Strange nightmares, even considering how crazy my normal nightmares were. But no sleep paralysis ever occurred in that house. The whole energy was different in this house. In my mom's old house, the atmosphere was very lonely. empty. But there at my dad's, all I could feel was danger. That was the more normal kind of ghost stuff. A couple years before my dad sold that house, the second scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life happened. Hell, it didn't even happen to me, but I heard it happen to someone or something else. I was laying in my bed one night, literally just about to fall asleep when I hear a scream across the street. That house was on a street that ran through the middle of the woods, right? And my great aunt lived next door to us. And across the street was an old couple who ran a very small maple syrup business. The next group of houses was much further down the street and separated by a ton of trees. This experience I had has led me to believe in paranormal creatures before I started seeing those pale guys crawling around. Before, I only believed in ghosts. So I heard a scream from across the street. I knew it wasn't the old man who lived across the street, as this absolutely blood-curdling scream sounded like a younger guy. There was only one guy that age that lived on my street, and that's much further down, and passed through loads of trees. Not to mention this guy is very much alive today, and I graduated high school with him. So it's pretty clear that this scream came from no one I knew, and there weren't any missing people in the area. No suspicious things happening. Nothing. No reason for me to hear what I did. So I roll over and turn to my window, but this scream sounded far, like in the woods behind my old neighbor's house. And while I suppose that couple could be murderers, I'd say it's highly unlikely, as they're sweet as can be, and their lights were all out. It stopped, and thinking I might just really be tired, I roll back over onto my back. The screaming started again, this time much worse. If you can imagine someone torturing another person in front of you in the most horrible of ways, this is how that guy would sound. It was awful. It sounded an awful lot like when that one dude disappears in the Blair Witch Project, and you know he's dead, but the witch is impersonating his final screams as she killed him. Awful screams. It brings out this primal instinct to help. But I had this overwhelming feeling to stay right there in bed for my safety as well. It was only a year later that I learned about skinwalkers and how they can impersonate people to draw in their victims. I think this might have been something like that. They also say that the farther away the scream is, the closer the creature is to you, which means that that thing could have been right outside my window after I rolled back over. I heard the scream one last time. The worst of it all, higher pitch, wordless, just moans, heavy breathing and screeching beyond terror. Then it very suddenly stopped, and for some reason I stopped worrying as soon as the screaming stopped and peacefully fell asleep. I seem to sleep the best when some of the scariest stuff happens to me for some reason. I've never asked my family if they heard something similar that night. At that house, I also heard my name whispered a lot, coming from right behind me. This one time I was talking about dogs. The parents left for work, and my brother was in the shower. And as I opened the door, I heard someone whisper my name right behind me. Obviously, no one was there. I asked my brother if he had called me just in case, but he said no. And my name isn't exactly common, so I can't really mistake Elena for the sound the door made as I opened it. That's the only time I've heard a disembodied voice that didn't belong to me or that man that I hear all the time. Okay, now on to the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. My dad was in the process of selling the house. I was 16. I was home alone and went to take the dogs out for a walk. Again, the property was big and bordered by a forest, with a tree line separating neighbors on one side of the house, and my great aunt on the other side of the house sharing our 2-acre wide lawn. The property was about 1.5 acres deep as well, so I normally just took the 3 little dogs to the far tree line, then to the side tree line, and if they hadn't done their business yet, I'd take them up the front yard. I hadn't even made it all the way down to the far tree line before they'd all done their business, and if they hadn't gotten it out there, I don't know what I would have done. So I started to take them back to the house when I hear a rustling noise way over in the side of the tree line, about a full acre away from where I was standing with the pups. Sound traveled strangely far in my backyard, maybe because it was so open before the tree lines. I look over at the tree line, and I swear I'm shaking when I say this, because I've only told a precious few. I see a tall, impossibly pale figure wearing what looked to be a dark gray suit and matching top hat, walking very strangely into my back tree line. Because my mind couldn't comprehend what the F I was seeing in broad but late daylight, I at first thought it was my neighbor from across the side tree line, but seeing the way it walked, looking closer at its skin confirmed the worse. When I say impossibly white, I mean it was just about the color of paper. Its skin stood out so much against the gray of the suit. I was seeing it from the side at first, so I didn't really get a look at its face, but from what I could see, it didn't really look like it had one. It was maybe 7 feet tall, and it went back and forth from hunching and straightening up as it walked. If you've played soccer, you'd know what knee highs are. Now imagine walking very slowly doing knee highs, taking one knee up to your chest, then the other, all the way up. That's how this thing walked. And from what I could see, there wasn't any hair on its head, nothing but a drab top hat. And it walked right next to my side tree line, looking and walking towards my far tree line. The dogs finally noticed that I was standing in the same place for a little too long, and looked over at this thing that I was seeing. Then one of my dogs barked and I freaked the F out. I looked back up, expecting to see it start running at me, but I think it was much creepier that it continued to walk the same way, towards the back tree line without looking over. All it did was slow down. Then my other dogs got in on the barking, and I just watched as it kept slowly walking towards my tree line. Who doesn't look in the direction of a dog barking, especially when it's really loud and echoing around the property? That's when I got this intense feeling of danger and grabbed all 3 pups and sprinted back to the house. Right when I was opening the back door, I looked back. I could barely see it still, but it was now standing still on the edge of the tree line, its legs hidden by brush, but its top hat and torso clearly visible. I locked all of the doors, windows, closed all of the curtains, turned off the lights, and cried on the couch with my dogs in my arms until my brother got home. I told him about it, and he was genuinely confused, because didn't believe me, but saw how scared I was. So he insisted it was a white-tailed deer or something, and made fun of me for thinking I saw Slenderman, even though I insisted that this thing wasn't lanky and wore a top hat. I had even called him when he was on his way, telling him to be careful and to pull into the garage rather than stop in the driveway and walk outside to the front door. My dad bought a new house. I guess I mean property, because it was barely even built when we bought it, intending it to be a camp 30 minutes away from his old house. It had no insulation, barely running water, no floor, etc. Dad and I built it up from that, adding an enclosed porch overlooking a brook, and built my room. Before we had restored it, that place always gave me the creeps. It was a lot like the feeling of the previous house, danger. But when it was restored, I felt great. I like to go for walks down our driveway, which by the way is a half-mile long one way, and a mile long the back way. It's really in the woods. The closest neighbors are a 7-minute drive away, so it was soothing to go for a walk down a nice dirt road surrounded by nature. But then I started getting that bad feeling again, and I started seeing things in the trees I couldn't make out. On one walk, I could have sworn I saw the figure in the top hat, faceless and now facing me, standing deep in the woods. Several times I somewhat thought I saw it, but this time I was near convinced, so I ran back to my house and I swear I could hear it running after me. But when I turned around at the clearing with my house, there was nothing there. But since I'm not completely convinced that I saw it or heard the footsteps, I'm not entirely sure that it was that figure. Not to mention I was 30 minutes away from my old house. This is when I started seeing those little pale guys out of the corner of my eye. I only saw them inside, and usually when it was dark. It all started at my dad's new house, but they seemed to follow me everywhere. The first time I saw one, I was going to the bathroom right before bed. It was pitch black out, and I left the door open since I was the only person sleeping downstairs, and my dad and his girlfriend were passed out upstairs. Since the door was open, I was looking directly into the kitchen, where we have a big marble island in the middle of it. I saw these long, pale fingers with claws slowly reaching around the corner of the island, but only if I looked over there out of the corner of my eye. I have very strange peripheral vision, and can see very clearly using it, so I could see those fingers very clearly. So then I stared straight at the island, hoping not to see those fingers again. But eventually, even though now I was looking straight at it and not using my peripheral vision, I saw a face emerge from around the corner close to the floor. It looked eerily like a drawing I made as a kid. but I don't remember seeing this thing prior to that moment. It was white, much like the top hat dude, but with dark splotches all over it. It had dark, sunken holes for eyes that I'm not exactly sure if it had eyes at all. And for a mouth, much like this drawing I had made, it didn't have a mouth hole, but a thin line of crusted and dripping goo in the form of a grin along its face. No hair. Yeah, imagine seeing that in the dark. Unpleasant. But then it just sort of faded out of existence as I was looking at it. It didn't suddenly disappear, but slowly faded away from my sight. So I got out and laid in bed terrified it would come back. I couldn't see it in my room though. I never have. Not there at least. And then, almost every night after that, I saw the same thing. Sometimes it crawled really fast past the bathroom doorway. I could see it move so clearly in the corner of my eye. It wasn't built like a human. It walked on all fours, but instead of an arched back like a human would have, its back was flat, and its legs were long and skinny and built like a messed up dog. Except for the arms, which were short with those long clawed fingernails. And I still see this thing. I've gotten so used to seeing it, I'm not even scared anymore, just weirded out and wondering if I'm crazy. A couple days ago, here at my mom's apartment, I saw it on the floor beside my bed. But when I turned back to look at it more, it scampered away. But it sounded like something was clawing at my rug all night long. Kinda like a cat. Both of my cats are dead, and they never play with a rug. So this weird thing was playing at the foot of my bed with my rug. So yeah, I think I'm haunted. Even though the poltergeist activity only happens at my dad's old house, I've seen one thing move in my room here at my mom's one time. I had my slippers at the end of my dresser. One night I walked into my room and one of my slippers had somehow gotten slurped up underneath my dresser. So I pulled it out from under, wipe it off and go to leave my room again when I hear it slide once more. This was recent. And since I'm so used to ghosts, this only annoyed me rather than scared me. Like, come on, my slippers? Do better. But I turned around and sure enough, the same slipper was completely underneath my dresser again. It hasn't happened since. Nothing has moved around me since. But I'm curious what the spirit from my dad's, which did feel malevolent, followed me here after all these years. But why? And even more creepily, although I'm the happiest I've ever been as of right now, the haunting seems to be the worst. Only the feeling of the ghost's presence isn't scary anymore. It's almost relaxing to know that they're there, and I don't know why it suddenly changed. But the weird thing is that I'm constantly waking up with scratch marks on my wrists, arms, and hands. Scratches that range from the size of my thumb to the size of my fingernail. I sleep with my arms tucked into my chest and I have long fingernails, but this has never happened before. If anyone knows what this means, I'd really appreciate some help. I could just be paranoid. After writing this, I'm a little nervous to deal with my ghostie and everything else I've experienced. I have a tiny scratch at the base of my thumb right now, actually. Again, I'd love to know what people think about all of this, and if anyone has seen similar things. I really hope I'm not alone here. I'll try to keep this relatively short, as there isn't a whole lot to it. When I was a kid, I would stay over at my grandfather's house every other day while my mother was out doing stuff. Normally, I don't feel scared of this house unless it's late at night, but something happened in the morning when I was 4 years old. This particular morning, my aunt, who was staying upstairs for a period of time, had left the house before either me or my grandfather had awoke. Later, my grandfather, assuming she was still asleep upstairs, had left to run some errands. I would sleep in the same bed as him, so when I woke up, I noticed he wasn't in bed and called out to him. After a few minutes, I began to panic, and I got out of bed to run upstairs to see if my aunt was there. And that's when I saw it. A tall, pitch-black figure standing directly in front of her door, which was closed. There were literally no features on this figure, and it stood completely motionless. My best description is that it looked like a three-dimensional, humanoid shadow. I began to creep towards it, but when I got close to it, I decided to just go back downstairs. still panicking with tears in my eyes. I wasn't scared of the shadow, but I guess my human nature kicked in and told me not to get within arm's length of something I didn't understand. My mother, discovering I was alone from talking to both my aunt and grandfather, sped over to his house as quickly as possible to pick me up. I was more afraid that I'd get in trouble for peeing the bed than I was of the shadow man upstairs. When I changed my clothes and got in the car, my mother asks me, "Did you try to go upstairs to see if your auntie was there?" To which I replied, "I tried to, but that man was standing in front of the door." Keep in mind, this is coming from a 4-year-old who barely has a grasp of the concept of lying. Imagine hearing that from your kid randomly, of all things. I'm an adult now, and have heard from my mother that when she was younger and was studying over at my grandfather's house, that one night she woke up and saw 2 men talking in the hallway, but couldn't make out what they were saying. When she screamed to wake her dad up and turned back towards the hallway, they were gone. My grandfather's house is pretty old, so between these 2 experiences, I think there is at least one spirit haunting his house. I haven't really experienced any more paranormal stuff other than seeing a shadow of what looked like my dog running to the side of my bed. My buddy saw it too. But I'll never forget that tall, featureless figure. Before I get into this story, I want to preface that everything I'm telling you is 100% true. There's enough fake stories on here that I don't want to make one up myself. This happened to me in my early teens. I'm 21 now. My best friend growing up had this huge farmhouse in the middle of Virginia. It was very old and beautiful, but also had a very dark history. In the house, there is a tunnel that led to an underground room of sorts that was used for slaves to hide in the 1800s. And I'm 90% sure that some died down there while in hiding, so you can imagine the history and energy that fills this house. I always felt scared there. I never felt alone, and wouldn't go anywhere alone in the house, even just to grab something out of my room. Even the family was scared to stay there with no company because of the intense apparitions and experiences, which I can get into another day. The rooms were massive, and the entire house was white, with honestly creepy vintage decor. There was even a cabinet of ventriloquist dolls upstairs. No joke. They were a really odd family, honestly, with lots of dark problems. Anyways, the second time I visited that house, I was with my mom, my best friend at the time, and her mom. It was a girls' trip. One night I woke up and was so thirsty, and the last thing I wanted to do was go downstairs and get water. I was terrified. I hated that house at night, but my mom was deep asleep, so I literally sprinted downstairs with my head only looking at the floor. I made my water in 5 seconds, and when I made it to the stairs, something compelled me to look at the giant glass doors that were in front of the stairs. I was horrified, but felt like I needed to look out the window. What I saw when I looked out that window will haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw a man as real as anything I've ever seen. It was pitch black outside with a huge bright moon. The man was all black, like a silhouette, but because of the moon being so bright, I could clearly see his entire body. He was blacker than black, like he stood out so much. I 100% thought he was a trespasser. He was wearing a top hat and was unhumanly tall, like 7 feet. My heart literally felt like it stopped beating. I felt like I was in a trace. I was so unexplainably horrified, but I couldn't look away. He was moving a little bit, almost like breathing. Then about 10 seconds later, he was gone, disappearing into thin air. I panicked and bolted upstairs after I snapped out of my trance. I cried to my mom and was up all night. The next morning, I told my friend and her mom about the experience, and they were not shocked at all, as they had seen multiple full-body apparitions in the house themselves. The nanny that worked for them even refused to go into some of the rooms of the house. I never went back to that house again. Growing up, I always knew that my childhood home was a little different. Strange things would happen without explanation, and an eerie feeling would often linger in the air. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway, but when I opened my door, no one was there. Another time, I found a toy that I had lost months prior sitting in the middle of my room, as if it had been placed there deliberately. But the most vivid experience I had was when I was home alone and heard someone whisper in my name. I called out, thinking it was a family member, but there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered and my room grew colder. I felt a presence in the room with me, and knew without a doubt that it was not human. I never felt unsafe in my childhood home, but the unexplainable occurrences definitely left an impression on me. Even now, years later, I still wonder what kind of energy or entity resided in that house. Have you ever experienced anything like this? This morning I remembered a story told to me by my mom, who had in turn heard it from her mom, my grandmother. In the late 1930s, my grandmother was a young woman living in a farm in Yorkshire, England. She would walk to and from school every day along the country lanes surrounding the farm. One winter afternoon, as she was walking back home, she saw a man lying in the middle of the road, covered in what she assumed was mud. It was getting dark, but she described him wearing a light trench coat, and the mud was very bold, as it contrasted in blotches against the fabric. Even in sleepy 1930s rural England, young women knew the dangers posed by strange men. As the whole scene looked so odd, she decided to go out of her way and walk through farmland back to her home. She told her parents about it. Her father went to see for himself, but found nothing there. That was the end of it. A year later, she walked back from school, and when she got home, her parents told her there had been an accident. A man had been found near the farm. He'd either been trampled by a horse or hit with a car. The man was dead. They told her not to go into the kitchen, as that was where his body was being kept while they waited for help. Curiosity got the better of her, of course. She looked in the kitchen, and on the table she immediately recognized the same man she'd seen lying in the road a year earlier. Only this time she realized the dark blotches on his coat weren't mud, it was blood. I believe this story to be true, simply because it was told to me by my mom, and to her by her mom. What happened though? Did she have a premonition? Was it some weird time-traveling ghost manifestation? I've not heard of a similar story that I can remember. Ghost on the intercom. Some context. When I was in my early teens, I believed I was followed by the spirit of a young girl. I believe she inhabited one of my porcelain dolls my grandmother had given me. Often I'd see her in my dreams or feel her presence. I can't explain it, but I feel like she may have been the ghost in this story. My parents used to live in a big 3-story house that had an old built-in intercom. There were speakers in every room of the house, minus the bathrooms. And even though it was old, we still liked playing around with it every now and again. You'd have to have the speaker turned on and turn the volume all the way up, usually, to even hear anything clearly. You also had to physically push a button to speak into it. Once in a while, the intercom would come on by itself and play something on the radio. I found this spooky, but my mom brushed it off as the past owner having set an alarm via the intercom so that the radio would come on at certain times. We didn't know how to reprogram it, hard as my stepdad tried, and my parents were tired of often getting woken up at 3 a.m. by the radio randomly coming on through the intercom in their room. So we decided to just not use it anymore, and turned all the intercoms off, with the volume all the way down just as an extra measure. One night I was chatting online with my friends on the computer, and I hadn't noticed the time was around 3 a.m. Suddenly the intercom came on in my room at full blast. It was horribly loud static coming through. I jumped up to shut it off, but as I reached for the volume dial, I saw it was already at 0/off. I didn't know how to make the noise stop. Then through the static, I faintly heard what sounded like someone breathing. And then I heard the voice of a little girl. She said, "When will you come to your senses?" And then, just as fast as it had come on, the intercom shut off. Silence. I was frozen with fear. Being a teen, I jumped back on the computer to tell my friends what had just happened, and they said, "Get out of that house." I had to go tell my parents. The hallway was pitch black, and I had to go all the way down a big staircase in the dark to their room. I held my breath and flung my door open, sprinting down the stairs, crying from how scared I was. I banged loudly on my parents' door and heard my mom yelp. She opened the door and I ran in to tell them what had happened. They were more upset that I woke them up. My mom told me it was probably just a commercial on the radio or something. I mentioned how my intercom had been turned off with the volume down to 0, and also what kind of commercial would say something like that. Seeing as it was so late, she didn't feel like trying to rationalize it. I was sent back up to bed. And if you guessed I didn't sleep that night, you'd be correct. I had an unexplainable experience occur about 5 years ago. I was a junior in high school. After the school day was over, my best bud at the time and I went over to his dad's house. With the house to ourselves, our plan was to hunker down in his room and play MCC Halo 2 on Legendary and see truly how hard the game is. We're in the middle of the level outskirts, just before you reach Jackal Sniper Alley, and in the next room over we heard a noise. The adjacent room was the parallel laundry room, which had a closed door to the garage. The garage door's handle squeaks. Our ears catch the noise, and we pause the game just as the door creaks all the way open. We are staring out the bedroom door, into the hallway. We can see the doorway of the laundry room, but not into the room itself. We were expecting to see who was coming in from the garage, assuming it was his dad. Instead, the garage door slammed shut so hard we could feel it connect with the wall. We're stunned. We start freaking out because no one else should be home right now, so I immediately assume there's an intruder. We gather some random items to use as weapons and literally breach the garage like Rainbow Six Siege. We stacked up and opened the door as I yelled, "Whoever the F is in here, come out right effing now." Silence. Stale silence and utter darkness. We flip the lights on and begin to search of the garage. I tell my buddy to check if the side door to the backyard is locked. It is. While he looks around outside, I make note that there are no windows in this garage. No feasible escape that wouldn't leave a trace for us to find. All there was my bud's dad's old, unused rusty truck and a bunch of empty cabinets. Yes, I searched the cabinets. No one was in the garage except for us. I've told multiple people this story, and over the years, not a single explanation I haven't already accounted for and disproved. The obvious question is wind. No. I've had wind open or close doors before, and you know when it's the wind. Besides, we would have heard the garage rattling if the wind was hard enough to blow open and slam a door. I would like to note, there is a possibility someone actually did break in and manually opened a garage door to slide out under it. But that is so unlikely. Not only would we have heard it move, but it would make so much more sense to hit the garage hanger button. There's also the possibility that in the midst of the panic, my bud mistook the side door for being locked when it actually wasn't. No matter which way you cut it, I have a freaky ghost/home intruder story. When I was around 12 years old, my best friend and his family moved to the country on a large tract of land with several buildings. The first was an old house that had been the original residence before the previous owner started to construct a new house towards the back of the property. I had stayed there once when they first bought the property, while the old owner was still packing up their other house. But I don't recall much about that night. We had spent all day walking around the land. I just remember being so tired, I went to bed before 8. The weekend that they moved into the house, they invited me to stay the weekend with them. It was a nice new house that the previous owner had built, but didn't quite finish. It wasn't until years later that I found out it was because his wife had passed away and he just couldn't finish it, so he put it up for sale. It was just a large ground floor that he designed to be accessible and a large basement that was largely unfinished. When you would go down the stairs to the basement, it opened up to a large room with wood paneling that he had intended to turn into a den, connected to a workshop by a door, all just revealing the concrete floor. Through the workshop, there was another door that led into the garage. He had built a nice long workbench out of the wood, but it had largely looked unused. That weekend, we had moved down a couple couches, furniture, a handful of rugs, and most importantly, the TV and video game systems. After moving everything in, we spent that evening staying up late playing video games. I must have fallen asleep on the couch first, because when I first woke up, I could see the static of the TV still on the TV. I was cold and tired, so I just cozied up and went back to sleep. A little while later, I had awoken and saw his mom walk down the stairs in a robe. I assumed she just wanted to check on us and turn the TV off. I quickly closed my eyes so she wouldn't think that I was awake and left the TV on. After a few moments, I could still hear the slight hiss of the TV and expected it to turn off at any moment, but it didn't. I slowly started to open an eye to peek, and his mom was standing right in front of the TV staring at us. I thought this was weird and quickly closed my eyes. Trying to picture his mom, I suddenly realized, this person is too tall and thin. This woman was not his mom. Slowly opening an eye, I looked down at the TV and the glow of the static was seemingly passing through a set of legs before disappearing at the feet. Quickly closing my eyes, I tried to imagine I was anywhere else. The next morning, I was the first one up, but didn't want to say anything since they just moved in. The next few times I would visit, I would stay in his room in a sleeping bag on the floor, and we would play video games there. It was while looking back, I don't think we ever spent much time down there. This past year, when we finally reconnected after many years, I asked him if he ever had any paranormal experiences at his house. His first response was his basement. He didn't say what, but his cats avoided it, and he felt some kind of presence down there, and he said that he just avoids it when he's there. I don't know if it was the original owner's wife come to check up on the new occupants, but I'll never forget that transparent figure in a knee-length robe standing in front of the TV, disappearing at the feet. Stuff moved in my sleep, and this was never explained. I'll keep it simple. My sister's bed is next to my bed, so close that I use it like a nightstand. I put my clothes for tomorrow and my glasses on that bed before I went to sleep. The glasses were at one end of the bed while I was on the other, and the clothes were on the same end. I woke up at like 2 a.m. for some reason and started playing a game on my iPad when I was going to go to the bathroom. I went to reach for my glasses, only to see they were gone, and my clothes were messed up on the side of the bed close to me, in front of my face. I initially thought my sister just moved my things, so I was just annoyed at first, and started looking for my glasses. And while doing that, it made less and less sense to me that this was the case, because my sister didn't live there, and she didn't have keys to the house. When I did find my glasses, they were at the foot of my bed with my chargers. I put them on, and this is when I really took in the situation. I went to the bathroom very confused and kind of creeped out, but my grandma lives with me, so I just tried to stay calm and ask her in the morning. In the morning when I asked, she said she didn't move my stuff and never got up last night. She said I probably sleepwalked. But that just doesn't seem right to me, because I've never sleepwalked before, and I'm not at the age where it just starts happening as a teenager. When I'm stressed, I can experience insomnia and exhaustion, which triggers episodes of sleep paralysis. But no one's ever told me I sleepwalk, and I'm not a particularly heavy sleeper. Plus, the way I tuck my feet in when I go to sleep under the sheets was the same when I woke up. And I don't know much about sleepwalking, but I thought it's simple motions and repeated behavior. It's a nonsensical pattern, yes, but it's almost too perfect. It's my conclusion that it was my grandmother, but I just don't see that either, because she doesn't sleepwalk either. Just something weird that happened. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Good night, everybody.